Greetings, my fellow Omoluabis. This is Ama Bookman with another episode of Ile Eko Omoluabi. Today I'm starting a different series called African Ancestors, where we are going to honor the legacy of African people from across the centuries and across the globe by recounting the stories of their travails and their triumphs. Today I want to commemorate our ancestor Julius Nyerere. Because he was leading fighter in our efforts for decolonization. Also, because he would lead what would become an independent Tanzania, he's known as Baba wa Taifa. In Swahili, that means father of the nation. Also, he was a teacher in his early career, and he worked to educate people in the political and economic independence. And so he was known as Mulima, meaning teacher. At the age of 33, when he was young, 1955, he went to the United Nations and he told them that Tanganyika would be ready for self-government in about 20 to 25 years. It turned out that this was a bit of an underestimation. There was a cascading collapse of colonialism sweeping through the African continent around this time. And about 6 years from when he gave that speech, it landed right at his door. In May 1961, he was already the prime minister of a self-governing Tanganyika. And only 7 months later, in December 1961, the nation gained its independence and he became its first president. Now, you should probably note, if you haven't already, that I am saying Tanganyika and not Tanzania. That was the country that comprised the mainland of Tanzania until it was united with the People's Republic of Zanzibar. It was a country from 1961 to 1964. However, I'm not just coming here to talk about him because he was Tanzania's first president. What I think is most important for us to remember about him is his role as Mulima, a teacher. And it's the lessons that he taught that I want to highlight for us today, because it's lessons that we didn't learn in his lifetime, and I'm afraid in a lot of ways we still need to learn. He taught 3 primary lessons: self-reliance, family-centered economics, and the necessity of Pan-African unity. Kujitegemea, self-reliance in Swahili. That was the cornerstone of his political and economic vision. In 1967, he published a booklet called Education for Self-Reliance, where he called for the transformation of Tanzania's educational system from the one that was prioritizing the needs of the colonizers to ones that was responsive to the needs of the people and consistent with their culture. Now, the colonial system that they had left Tanzania, and I could say the system that they had left all of Africa, was one that where students were really being trained for jobs. Maybe well-paying jobs in some cases, not usually. But nonetheless, it's important to note the primary focus is jobs. More importantly, not jobs that were responsive to the needs of the people, but jobs that were responsive to the dictates of the global economy. The global economy that Africa had been propelled into during colonization, and more specifically, the colonial state. What he saw as lacking in that educational system was an education that would, and let me read his words, transmit from one generation to the next the accumulated wisdom and knowledge of the society, and prepare its young people for future membership of that society and their active participation in its maintenance and development. In other words, they were not being given education that taught them what Africa was, what it would mean to be an African, and what it meant to be an African that develops Africa in an authentically African way. In the previously mentioned booklet, Education for Self-Reliance, he wrote, "The education provided to Tanzania for the students of Tanzania must serve the purpose of Tanzania." This reminds me of what a lot of our great thinkers like Amos Wilson has taught us, that a lot of the ways we're being educated, or the famous book, The Miseducation of the Negro, is a common theme in which we are often miseducated, not for our own purposes, but for the purposes of somebody else. And this ancestor recognized that very early on. So he adds, "It must encourage the growth of socialist values that we aspire to. It must encourage the development of proud, independent, and free citizenry, which relies upon its self for its own development and which knows the advantages and the problems of cooperation. It must ensure that the educated know themselves to be an integral part of the nation and recognize the responsibility to give greater service, the greater the opportunity that they had." Nyerere called for an educational system that emphasized cooperative endeavors over individual advancement, elevated concepts of equality, promoted responsibility to serve, and infused the youth with skills needed for practical and functional development. He also encouraged the development of self-reliance. This was a very big deal for him. Nyerere called for self-reliance not just in education, but through all aspects of Africa. He noticed that Africa was getting caught up in the crippling debt as foreign interests were enticing them with the prospect of development. Thus, he cautioned Africa to forego economic endeavors if they didn't develop the human capital to carry it out internally. In fact, he makes this really bold statement: "We will leave our minerals in the ground until we manage to develop our own geologists and mining engineers." Now imagine if we had that attitude. We're not going to do anything until we can build it ourselves. Either we're not going to do anything, or we might become motivated to develop the capacity to take care of these things. Relatedly, Nyerere urged Africans to flee the temptation of aid and to rely on self-reliance also to alleviate poverty. So let me read something else he said. He said, "It's stupid to rely on money as a major instrument of development when you know all too well that our country is poor. It's even more stupid to imagine that we shall rid ourselves of poverty through foreign financial assistance rather than our own financial resources." He said, "You end poverty not through charity. Within a single nation, you don't end poverty through charity. You get people to work. You allow them to work. You get jobs for them. Get them trained, and they work. Tax people." For Nyerere, it just seemed obviously naive to imagine that rich nations, especially the very same rich nation that just colonized Africa, would invest in their development. And if they did, it would certainly come at the cost of their independence. Now, I think it's a testament to his foresight and his prescience as a leader and a political thinker that he foresaw the economic futility, not to mention the political pitfall, of what really kind of became Africa's developmental strategy in the post-colonial era. Today, we've got books like Dambisa Moyo, Debt Aid, which I highly recommend. It's called Debt Aid: Why Aid is Not Working and How There's a Better Way for Africa. In this book, she brings out how it has failed and has promoted the culture of corruption that we're often complaining about. Today we hear President of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, speaking of an Africa beyond aid, and he's perceived as a bold and exciting idea. However, these voices are just saying what Julius Nyerere already said and already foresaw at the gate of Africa's independence. He warned Africa against the clear present danger. Unfortunately, he was not heard. There's a document called the Arusha Declaration, and I'll discuss it a little bit later. And in that document, which was a collaborative document, but mostly he wrote it, it says, independence means self-reliance. Independence cannot be real if a nation depends upon gifts and loans from another for its development. The self-reliance that Nyerere spoke of should not be confused with the kind of free market individualism we're a little bit more familiar with in the West. What he was really after was to foster a nation that achieved national independence through communal interdependence. Now hear me well, independence through communal interdependence. If you run around in Pan-Africanist circles in America, you will surely encounter the word Ujamaa, meaning familyhood in Swahili. This word Ujamaa that Nyerere used to define his economic vision, which he saw as a unique form of African socialism. In 1967, he and the party of TANU promulgated the Arusha Declaration. This was put forth as the country's official policy, and it outlined the principles that would govern the nation's social and economic development. It's based on an idea that could only be achieved through Kujitegemea, not through foreign aid, not through foreign direct investment, but through self-reliance. Ujamaa, familyhood or family economics, was proposed as a traditional and typically African way to collectivize independent development. Ujamaa was founded on the philosophy of development that was based on three critical components: freedom, equality, and unity. Ujamaa embraced aspects of Swahili's Utu, or the concept of common humanity, or Ubuntu as it's called in South Africa, and you might be more familiar with that. This is based on a philosophy of forgiveness, reconciliation, willingness to share. According to Nyerere, unlike Marxist socialist visions, African socialism wasn't really defined by class struggle, but the traditional African institution of the extended family. In fact, he went so far as to say that kind of class antagonism didn't really exist in pre-colonial Africa. I don't know if I'm ready to buy that. However, it's pretty important to note that he didn't embrace Marx's notion of a dictatorship of the proletariat, and certainly not the kind of warring between classes that we often think about when we think about socialism. Rather, for him, the notion was just a big extended family. And it's because the nation was a family that each would be provided for according to his needs, as Marx is known to have said. However, let me say it again. This family-based socialism was embedded within an ethic of social responsibility, especially the responsibility to be self-reliant. So in the Arusha Declaration, it says that there are only 4 kinds of people who can depend on other people: children, the elderly, the disabled, and those whom the government can't find work for. Now, he didn't consider it self-reliant when capitalists depended on labor of other people, or when landlords depended on rent for their living. Ujamaa was presented as a uniquely African economic model, that rejected Marxist class antagonism as well as dependency on the state that's often associated with communist governments. However, despite this intention to promote a uniquely African economic system, there are a lot of ways that Ujamaa in practice mirrored some of the aspects of socialist nations that we're kind of familiar with. So let me give you a couple. Communization of the workforce, collectivization of the means of production, nationalization of private businesses, and the provision of public services such as healthcare and education. I'm not saying these are bad things. I'm just saying that there were a lot of similarities. The policies, and this might be where some of it might be negative, also accompanied some of the bloated bureaucracies and single-party rule that we also think about when we think of socialist countries. Now, after the Arusha Declaration, Nyerere nationalized the banks and large enterprises. Furthermore, he wanted agriculture to be under the control of the farmers and their cooperatives and not the landowners, which is somewhat of a dictatorship of a proletariat, maybe a little bit. Let me know what you think in the description box. Now, you actually might find some of his ideas about land ownership a little difficult to swallow. He kind of was afraid that unbridled license to buy and sell land as people saw fit would lead not just to inequality and to foreign usurpers, but he really kind of saw it as inherently problematic, if not even unethical. There was one time he said, "We don't need a degree in economics to know that neither the worker nor the landlord produces land. Land is God gives to man. It's always there." He was afraid that rich foreigners would simply buy land from poor Tanzanians, and over time, the land would belong to wealthy immigrants, and the local people would become their tenants. Land ownership now, including the right to do whatever you want with it, sell it, buy it, is almost kind of sacrosanct in the free market capitalist canon. So you might be tempted to say, yeah, he was a radical. You might be tempted to dismiss him as just another Marxist. But think about it. Acknowledge that a lot of land dispossession that occurs simply because people with a lot of money can simply buy the land. This is happening in tons of places in America, for example. The Gullah Geechee lands are being bought up. Now, if you don't know what the Gullah Geechee are, they are a group of enslaved Africans who settled in South Carolina. And because their masters were a little bit less strict than some of the masters of other enslaved African communities in America, they were allowed to retain a lot of their African culture. But it's not just that land. You've got places like DC, Atlanta, Harlem, all of which have become gentrified as wealthy whites have been able to supplant longtime residents. And if you think about it, to gentrification at a national level, that's just colonization. So these seemingly radical ideas that Nyerere had brought up sort of in the eye of the storm, the battle of the second half of the 20th century. And that, of course, is a struggle between capitalism and socialism, with America and the Soviet Union being sort of like at the head of that, but it really was a global fight. And another aspect of that socialist experiment that mirrored some of the common experiments that other socialist nations face was that they had to deal with interference and sabotage, really, from capitalists and imperialists. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to determine whether the failure that occurred here, not to mention the failure that occurred in a lot of other socialist countries, is just a natural consequence of a flawed economic vision, or is it the result of sabotage from the West and their moneyed interests? This is article called Deconstructing Ujamaa, the Legacy of Julius Nyerere in the Quest for Social and Economic Development in Africa. And in that article, the author says, as a way of teaching Tanzania a lesson in preventing other African nations from following her example, Western countries and international financial institutions which they controlled were bent on ensuring the failure. Repeat that. They were bent on ensuring the failure of Ujamaa. So hard for us to tell that they fail because outsiders worked hard to make them fail, or did they fail because they had bad ideas? I'll give you some examples of that failing. There were 3 British banks, Barclay, Standard, and National, and Gringley. They adopted a policy of non-cooperation that ensured that the public center banking system failed. And when they weren't undermining policy, a lot of the people were just ignoring it. So for example, many of the corporations that had been nationalized formed partnership with foreign firms, sometimes the very same people that they had been nationalized from. And Tanzania, not having the political and military strength to enforce the policies that she promulgated, was effectively still under the control of foreigners after independence. Like a lot of post-colonial countries, Tanzania found that independence was almost kind of symbolic. One of the professors that I follow, in Ghanaian African American called Dr. Gambon, likes to call it flag independence. You get the flag, but when it comes to economics and politics, you don't really get to have a say. You think about the condition of post-colonial French nation and the path for the colonization of those nations they were basically forced to sign after decolonization. You can see based on that wasn't really independent. But if you think about it, one of the reasons that they're able to do that is post-colonial African nations could not act independently because they insisted on not acting interdependently. Again, that idea of interdependence, which is so necessary for our liberation. Julius Nyerere foresaw the pitfall of this strategy as well. He warned against the formation of a bunch of small African nations. I think we are up to 55 now. It used to be 54, now it's 55 with South Sudan. Calling at the very least for the formation of a federation of East African nations. He cautioned, saying, the balkanization of Africa is a source of weakness for our continent. The forces of imperialism and the neoliberalism will find their own strength in this basic weakness. Unity in his mind was the only way to resist the threat of Western imperialism. And he challenged African leaders to forgo their nationalist ambitions. I think this quote is really amazing. He said, I hope there won't be a Tanzania. If there's not an Africa, then at the very least, I hope there'll be an East Africa. But if we fail to use African nationalism, if we fail to take another step towards Pan-Africanism during that period, we should at least have a Tanzania that is committed to Pan-Africanism itself. Now, like all leaders, Nyerere made mistakes and had his fair share of critics. The TANU political party instituted one-party rule. Now, any idea that you have about democracy requires that you allow multiple parties, although there are good reasons to think that party politics is not all that great. Even worse, he's been accused of being a despot who repressed his political opponents. And I can't really say that Ujamaa brought about economic development. And in this regard, even he realized there were some strategic mistakes. In later years, he concluded that attempts at nationalizing agriculture was harder than he thought it would be, and it didn't really produce the results he wanted. But despite these failings, he's still a much beloved person in Tanzania. And I would say he's an ancestor worthy of veneration both on the continent as well as in the diaspora. And if pouring libations is your thing, go ahead and do that. But I would also urge you not to do to this ancestor what we do to a lot of other ancestors. We celebrate their name, but we fail to apply the lessons that they wanted to teach us. Today in Africa, as well as in the diaspora, Black people fail to practice Kujitegemea, creating ample spaces for those with white savior complex to offer misguided aid. Black people fail to practice Ujamaa, allowing new colonizers to dominate the economics of our communities and nation. Black people fail to embrace Umoja, new word, unity, rendering ourselves ever weak and vulnerable to political, military, and economic assault. Julius Nyerere was one of the few who foresaw the tragedy of post-independent Africa and prescribed a lot of the remedies that have become in fashion again. He called Africa to value and retain its indigenous knowledge. He saw that there were unique treasures in our languages, in our cultures, and that those needed to be preserved and cultivated. For example, he was instrumental in the decision to make Kiswahili the language of business, commerce, government, and Tanzania. And thus he ensured that the country's people were drawn into its decision-making process because they were being educated in their mother tongue. And of course, if you're running Pan-Africanist circles, you would also know that Kiswahili is often touted as the default language for a unified African continent. There were difficult years and much work needs to be done to elevate Tanzania to its political potential. It's one of my favorite countries. In fact, I have a friend who moved there recently. The country is in a lot of ways a model of cohesion, stability, and economic progress on the continent. Self-reliance, family economics, and Pan-African solidarity. These three things mark the social, economic, and political vision that Julius Nyerere sought to teach us, and these visions remain as relevant today in 2020 as it was in 1961. So please join us in remembering and celebrating the life of Julius Nyerere. And remember, as I always like to say, a tree does not make a